I'm here at one of my favorite beaches in Seattle, Washington, and in addition to doing some sightseeing later today, I'm here to explain to you why I think Washington has the stupidest name of any of the 50 states. I'm Knowles, I'm here to explore and explain. Now let me get this out of the way to begin with. This isn't motivated by some hatred of George Washington or any of the other founding fathers or any of our national values. I think they're some of the greatest men to have ever lived, and I think despite many of its flaws, the system that they set up for us is pretty great. It's just that naming things after presidents is a little too monarchical for my taste. That's something that happens in countries less democratic than ours. Sure, we should honor and emulate their statesmanship and their virtues, but we need to remember that they were human too. But the main reason that I think this is a dumb name is because there are just better names that it almost had. So let's go back to the 1840s here to understand what I'm talking about. Until 1846, the Oregon Country was a vast, undefined territory stretching from the ocean to the mountains and from Mexican California up to Russian Alaska. It was jointly occupied and jointly governed by the Americans and the British. All throughout the 1840s, starting from Kansas City, hundreds of thousands of American pioneers traversed the Great Plains, the Rocky Mountains, and the deserts in their Conestoga wagons, and followed the Oregon Trail to a little place called Fort Vancouver, Oregon Territory. The fort was named for the same British explorer that Vancouver, British Columbia is named for, and that kind of only adds to the confusion, but we'll get onto that later. 99% of these settlers decided to cross the river and go south into the Willamette Valley in what is now Oregon State, and that's where the better farmland was, and that's where the center of government was. But there were a few, probably 1,000 or so, that decided to go north of the Columbia River, finding their way up into the Cowlitz Valley, into the Puget Sound area, as well as going east of the mountains over by Walla Walla. Now, these settlers north of the river knew that Oregon Territory was quickly going to become a state, and they knew that before that happened, they wanted to be separate from it. They thought that since the center of power was south of the Columbia River, nobody would ever pay attention to their needs north of the river, and it wouldn't be unprecedented for such a huge state to be created. Just look at California, which had been created in 1850. So these settlers fought really, really hard, and eventually they sent a petition to Congress to create a separate territory north of the Columbia River. Their proposed name? Well, Columbia. You see, the Columbia River had been named in 1792 by Captain Gray, who named it after his ship. His ship was called the Columbia because Columbia was, at the time, a poetic name for the Americas, the land of Columbus, and this was especially used to refer to North America beginning in the colonial period. That's where Columbia, South Carolina, and Columbia, South America, as well as hundreds of Columbia counties and towns all across the country come from. Even our special government district between Maryland and Virginia got its name, the District of Columbia. But Congress looked at the Northern settlers' petition and said, yeah, you should be your own separate territory, but Columbia is a confusing name. Everybody's going to get it mixed up with the District of Columbia. You know what we should call it instead? Washington Territory. That way nobody will ever get it confused with anything else in the entire country. And so it became that part of Oregon Territory north of the Columbia River became the Washington Territory. That far northern part of the Oregon Country that was still controlled by Great Britain became British Columbia, which probably felt like a jab to those settlers who wanted this to be called Columbia. And while few Americans would actually get the two confused, we do speak in a way that is a result of the double naming. The name of our capital city isn't Washington, D.C. That's like saying Pittsburgh, PA every time you mention the city. It's just the city of Washington inside of the D.C. And while most people do just say D.C., which is technically correct as well since it's basically a city-state, I think that may also have come from the name confusion. Now here's the part where I have to admit that their thinking does make a little bit of sense. When this was happening in 1853, there were two cities within the District of Columbia, Washington and Georgetown. Later on, the local government was amended so that Washington absorbed the other city. So yes, more people may have been saying District of Columbia on a regular basis back then. But you know what? I don't think Columbia is a good name for a state either. I think for the same reason that Washington is a bad name. Columbia is just too grand an idea to name a state after. None of our other states are named liberty or freedom or any of our other values. And that's what Columbia is, a personification of what America can be, what it should be. So my proposal is Cascadia, or Tahoma, or Puget. No, not Puget. Skagit, Snohomish, Yakima, any of the other great Native American names that exist in this territory. After all, that's how almost every other state got its name. Now historically, North Oregon actually makes the most sense, but it might make the state seem like an inferior addition to Oregon in the same way that West Virginia might seem like an inferior addition to Virginia in the eyes of many people. Well, what do you think? Give me your ideas in the comments down below. And next time you're talking about visiting Seattle or the Smithsonian, think about why you have to specify which Washington you're visiting. Thanks for watching.